All right. Everybody had a good lunch? Pasta? Gazebo, which isn't really a gazebo, it's just an old name, but so thank you for coming back on time. I hope you had a good time talking to folks, meeting old friends, making new friends. And as we're going on into the next session here in the afternoon, lessons learned, very technical term, but of course it's the number one thing we should do when we're in the middle of mayhem. Mayhem in Yemen, mayhem in Bangladesh, Syria and the Syria region. And before we go to that, I'm supposed to point out Joseph Money, Deputy Director, Integrated Roadmap, because he might have questions or answers to questions that you might have. So there's the man with the roadmap in the back as we embark on the big integrated roadmap excursion with WFP. These big crises that we are in the middle of, really of an unprecedented scale, take the best of us, and I'm glad that we have the best people here in the room. I first would like to introduce you to our moderator, Justin Byworth, Global Humanitarian Director from World Vision International. Give him a warm welcome. Justin has a career spanning 30 years in the humanitarian aid and international development sector in the UK, Europe, Africa, and Asia. He was the CEO of World Vision UK before leading a team in Brussels, influencing EU policy on humanitarian action, peace and conflict, on nutrition, faith, and development. That's a big plate. And now you have Brexit, but we won't talk about that, Raoul, right? Okay, so whatever. Then next to me, he is on the panel on Yemen. So the first panel is on Yemen, and later in the afternoon we do Syria and Bangladesh. So on the first panel on Yemen, he's joined by Arif Husain, who's the Chief Economist and Deputy Director of Policy and Programs here at WFP. Give him a warm welcome. Yes. There's no guy working harder than this man. He's like the James Bond of the World Food Programme. He can explain anything to you, and he's the only one in the organization who understands the numbers that we always talk about. And he's going to kill me for saying this. Good, so wonderful that I know you spent the night working on Yemen numbers. He's also the director of the Food Security Analysis and Trends Service. And he has worked for the World Bank and taught at the Hubert H. Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs. So even more titles. I don't know, how big is your business card? You don't have one, it's pointless. Then we have, joining him is Julien Schopp, the Director of Humanitarian Practice, Interaction. Julien supports humanitarian emergency responses and contributes to the improvement of humanitarian practice. On behalf of the network's members, and Julien, also deep field experience, has worked in Ethiopia, Ivory Coast, and Uganda, Congo and Brazzaville, and Sudan and Chad. And the most important person on the panel, Inge Breuer, joins us. Also from WFP, she has over 20 years of humanitarian experiences. We start them young in this shop, mostly in the field, covering natural disasters and conflicts. She's now working on the Yemen crisis, was before in Senegal, North Caucasus, and worked on the Indonesian tsunami. She's part of the support team of the high-level panel on global food crisis. That's what she did in the past in New York. And she was one of the leading folks on working on emergency preparedness at WFP. So it's a fantastic panel. I hand it over now to the moderator who will wrangle the circus of expertise.
Bettina, thank you, and welcome everybody to the afternoon. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. I hope you're coffeeed up enough to bring energy to this session, where Valerie said this morning that we're going to be, this 2 days is with our sleeves rolled up. So now we're going to get our sleeves rolled up, in fact, maybe even our trousers rolled up, and dive into the grassroots of the reality of different humanitarian contexts we're working in. 3 very challenging significantly different, but maybe some common learning situations, starting with Yemen, then moving on to Bangladesh, and then moving on to Syria. These are the places that keep us awake at night. These are the places that give us sometimes glimpses of hope, of something that we can do as humanitarians, whatever organizations we are for, that we can see some gems of good practice from the field that we can take some learnings from. We can cross-fertilize those learnings across different humanitarian situations, but also maybe sometimes we can take those learnings up into influence and into policy. That's the focus of this panel, is first with Syria, then with Bangladesh, first with Yemen, then with Bangladesh, then with Syria, to dive deep into one context, but to pull out from all of us, and that means all of you as well, your experiences of what are we seeing, what are we hearing, what are we learning, how to navigate these complex, challenging contexts. On the day when the peace talks have started, I think starting with Inge, you're based in Sana'a. Bring a bit of that into the room for us so that we can get that insight and that perspective into the context in Yemen and some of the challenges, some of the opportunities, some of the learnings. So, over to you.
Thank you so much, Justin. Hello to everybody here. A big thanks to Bettina. You really flattered me today. As we're meeting here today, my colleagues are meeting in Yemen, in Sana'a, with many of your representatives on the ground. In fact, they're meeting with them to see how we can go about the scale-up, which is basically the second scale-up in just 1.5 years. Because it was in August 2017 that for the first time, we reached 7 million beneficiaries under the General Food Assistance, together with 31 partners. Among those 31 partners, 15 international NGOs, also national NGOs and some governmental entities. And now we are preparing to scale up to what likely will be around 12 million by January, February. So you can imagine this is a momentous task. Because as for the month of November, we aim to reach 8 million. We're basically scaling up 50%. So it's a tremendous task, and we really need to continue working all together, hand in hand, to make that happen. And we really rely on you with all your networks on the ground to make that happen. Mind you, it's not only on the general food assistance that we're scaling up, we are also scaling up on nutrition. Because you may have heard the executive director, he was recently out there in Yemen, he's visited hospitals, and he's seen himself that it's the children and the pregnant women and the lactating mothers who are really the most vulnerable. And as we have reached already 1.1 million, there is the aim to reach up to 1.5 million children that are either in mothers that are either malnourished or at risk of being malnourished. And if I mention 1.5 million, you have to compare that with 2.9 million who are estimated to be malnourished. But we want to be realistic, because many of those malnourished are living in places where we have just no access to. And also it's difficult for the mothers to come out and to seek assistance. So even more so, we need to work very closely together to make that happen. Now, but I take it we already have achievements. I must say, if we jointly have been able to reach those numbers, I think this is an incredible achievement, because it's not just 7-8 million in 1 year, it's 7-8 million on a monthly basis. And this is a major achievement, and all of you who are contributing to that should be proud of it. But we have a lot of challenges, right? The challenges you've heard about. The key challenge is access. Access to get the food supplies into the country, access to get the food supplies to the people who need it. In fact, there are a few areas, as I mentioned before, in Hodeidah Governorate, where we haven't been access for quite some time, despite a lot of discussions with all the different factions on the ground. There are other challenges also in terms of it's a very highly charged political environment. And there's always the risk that our assistance may come with some conditionality. And we have to stick together and advocate together that what we are doing and what we're assisting with comes with no strings attached. Yeah. It is also, we have a lot of pressure from the communities themselves. We are under pressure to prioritize. We don't have assistance, we don't have supplies for everybody in the country, but everybody feels affected by the conflict, right? But we can only assist those severely most insecure, those most hungry, those at the brink of starvation, which so far have been a third of the population and may soon be some 40% of the population, but you will still have 60% who will say, well, I'm in need as well, and I need to be assisted as well. And here we come together with you and we say, no, we can only assist those most vulnerable, those who would die without our assistance. So it's very difficult to explain this to the communities and of course also to explain this to the authorities. And then of course the donor community is watching us as they're have entrusted already a lot of funds into us. They want to be reassured that whatever is channeled through our hands will really reach those most vulnerable. But here comes then also my point on joint advocacy. I really see, and I think Julien will later speak more to it, it is the joint advocacy where we have been tremendously successful all together. I mean, with the NGO community, with ourselves, the UN, the whole UN rallied around it, the donor community, be it to keep Moderator open, for example. That is a tremendous success. I think also the fact that the peace talks are starting now, I think that is also one result of the massive joint advocacy that we've had, because we've always said, unless there is peace, the needs are only going to continue to grow. Right? As a closing point, perhaps I haven't talked much about livelihoods and asset creation, but it's something that resonates a lot with the authorities that we deal with on the ground. Even the authorities in the most vulnerable areas like Sada in the northwest, where I visited in June. In fact, they were very keen on livelihood support, more keen even than on humanitarian assistance. So this is perhaps something where hopefully as the peace talks will yield a positive result, where we just need to invest in jointly. It's the school meals program that we've restarted now. We are giving snacks, but the children need much more than just snacks. The teachers also need to be supported. The whole infrastructure needs to be supported. So this is something, perhaps as we move on, once we have mastered the challenge of scaling up to 12 million, where we need to come together more closely. Thank you.
Arif, thank you. Inge, thank you for bringing the reality alive. Arif, you've been analysing more data than probably most of us have seen in our lifetimes on this. Give us that perspective also.
Okay, thank you. I'm really happy to be here. One thing I just wanted to say up front was that when the executive director went to Yemen only a few weeks ago, he took me with him as well. And that was my third trip to Yemen. And one of the reasons why I was, usually when the executive director goes, I say, I don't want to go with you. I'd rather go right after you, because then you can get a lot more, because people are excited about his visit and you can get data and you can talk to people. But in Yemen, I took that opportunity to go with him also because it allowed me to go to Aden, talk to the Prime Minister, but also the Governor of Central Bank, for example. And we went to Hudaida, and we were in Sana'a. So it sort of gave us helped me to build a bigger picture on the economic side, but also to compare how I saw things, let's say about 2 years ago, and then last year, and then this year. And it was kind of interesting that when I was there, I was like, look, people are focusing on these 8 million, 12 million, 15 million people, but when And if the economy is tanking, what about the rest? You know? And I started to push for the rest. And why did that become so important? And now I've become an economist right now. I say, okay, so look at it from the consumer side and look at the problem from the producer side. And one thing you know about Yemen is that majority of the stuff which they consume, particularly on the food side, but also on the fuel side, is imported. So if there is such dependence on imports, anything which happens to the currency has a direct impact on your purchasing power, which is different than other places where we have seen, let's say, devaluation of currency or hyperinflation, like South Sudan. At least people produce their own food. Or Zimbabwe, at least people produce their own food. So this was sort of unique about Yemen, that it has direct impact in terms of imports. So closure of ports, change of depreciation of currency, things like that take a different meaning than they would take elsewhere, which we are more used to. So I said, okay, if I have to explain this, how do I break this problem? Said, what do we know for sure? Look, it's a war zone, things are changing, you have access issues, you have monitoring issues, you have assessment issues. So what do you know for sure? Well, we know that there are 28, 29, 30 million people. We also know that about 8 million livelihoods have been lost. We also know that the remittances, even from 2016 comparison, it is at about a third of the level they used to be even in 2016. That was about 3.3 billion. Today, the estimate, the best estimate we have is about 1.3 billion. So we know that. We also knew that last 3-4 months saw the currency really, truly depreciate, which meant that if you compared it from January of 2015 till about 2 weeks ago, when it was 720, 3 weeks ago, there was a 65% decrease in your purchasing power just on the basis of the currency. So imagine that suddenly you have 1/3 of your purchasing power if you're lucky enough to have a job. And if you're lucky enough to get paid. There is 1.2 million people in the public sector who are getting irregularly paid. So just putting all of this together, and by the way, even if you're getting paid, remember, in a way, you have to, prices are going high because they have to match the dollars on the basis of which the imports came. So you don't have enough purchasing power again. And imagine that this is happening on a gradual basis. When you put this, all of this together from the consumer side, you say, yeah, 20 million people in need, probably more. Because you take out 10% people who generally in any given population, in any given situation, are always okay because they're rich. Others go out, come back, okay. So you say, okay, not only my data shows this, but even my logic shows this, that this is in this ballpark, this number. Then you say, what about the government? What can the government do, if it can do anything? And you say, okay, what does government of Yemen do? Fuel, exports. Right now, before the crisis, it was over 320,000 barrels per day. Today, it is less than 20,000 per day. Let's not even talk about the price of fuel, what happened over there. Tourism? Who wants to go to Yemen for tourism? So, okay, no tourism. Tax base? Well, you don't have jobs, your currency is depreciated, you're living in a war economy, who's paying taxes? So, where is the money with the government? Oh, also, the Central Bank of Yemen, which is a technocratic institution, and it was working pretty well till about 2016, and it goes to Aden, when most of the commercial banks are in the north. So the link is also, that is also broken. So you find out that there is no money in the central bank itself. Less than $400 million for a 30 million people population, which meant that in next year's imports, it is about less than a month's imports. Okay. So you see that the consumer is in a bad state, government doesn't have money, so how are people surviving? People are surviving purely, mass majority of people are surviving because of humanitarian assistance. And this goes to your work. And this is not only WFP, this is UNICEF, this is UNDP, this is all the others who are doing this. This is keeping the economy alive. So what was the biggest request from there? The biggest request very clearly was that we need money in the economy. We need to strengthen the real, because if we don't strengthen it, people don't have purchasing power. So it wasn't strengthening just the government or something like that. It is strengthening the economies, strengthening the society, so they have the purchasing power. So now if they have purchasing power, guess what? Markets are still working. That was a surprise to me. In Yemen, markets are still working. You can go and find things to buy. It's not like, oh, empty stores. There is stuff. But the markets have shrunk because there is no purchasing power. Now, what does the private trader say to you? The private trader says, I will only bring what I can sell. If people don't have money, why should I bring? Why should I take the risk? Okay? And, oh, by the way, also, I don't have any dollars. So if they don't have dollars, or if they're buying the dollars at a much higher rate, obviously they're not going to take it on themselves, they're going to pass it to the consumer. So because of that, so what do we need to do? So what we need to do is to inject money into the economy. What we need to do is to give confidence to the central bank. What we need to do is to ensure that traders are able to open something which is called a letter of credit. What is a letter of credit? Letter of credit is, if you are essentially an exporter and I'm an importer, I'm not going to give you the money till you send me the stuff, and you're not going to send the stuff till I give you the money. So how do we work? Right? So this is where the letter of credit comes in. And basically, that is a guarantee by my bank to his bank that if you send products A, B, and C, my bank is telling the other bank they will make sure that he gets the money, simply put. And when he sends the stuff, my bank tells me, as the importer, give me the money. So where do I get the money from? To give the bank? Through the consumers. So you have to inject money where? Into the consumers. So on one side, you have to inject money for the business to start. On the other side, you have to inject money for people to buy. But guess what? It's the same money when the cycle starts. No? That's the trick of starting regrowth in the economy. And this is what we are trying to do. What we think is that on a monthly basis, if we are allowed, if we can, put in about $200 million, we can start this cycle. And guess what? I said the exchange rate was 720 3 weeks ago. Guess where it is today? Close to 500. You know why? Because they have started to do some of this. They opened letters of credit worth $200 million in the last few months. But the trick is that it cannot be once. It has to be every month, it has to be consistent, it has to be like clockwork. And if that happens, and we continue to put some money into the economy through the beneficiaries, we can start the cycle again. And what is really important is that this cycle is not about the 8 or 10 or, again, 15 million people or 12 million people, which we are all are going to assist. It is about the entire economy. Why? Because otherwise, if not enough food is coming in, and especially if not enough fuel is coming in, your sanitation plants stop to work. Your transport stops to work. Your water cleaning plant stop to work. And if all of that happens, imagine what happens to the rest of the people as well. So for us to protect from going on to that side, we have to make sure that we push on both sides. We push on assisting people, but also through that, we push on stabilizing the economy. And if we are able to collectively do both, we can get out of this rut. Then the next question, and the last question that comes to me, is for how long? And that's where the twin track approach comes in. You need a political solution to the conflict. Until you find that, you need a free, adequate flow of humanitarian assistance. And my last point is that, unfortunately, it's not only the question of money. Obviously, you need the money, but you also need sustained humanitarian access every month. So you can go to the places where you need to go every month. You also need the right people to be able to get into the country. You also need the right type of equipment to do what you need to do, whether it is on the nutrition side or food security side. And if all of these is met, look, in 2000, we as collectively, we as humanitarians, we have the strength to deal with this crisis also. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. What a fascinating insight into the unique complexities of the economic crisis, as well as a political and a humanitarian crisis. From Julien, from an NGO perspective, a consortium, a membership organization of a great array of different US-based private organizations, and from a DC base, you've worked a lot on Yemen over the last year and more. I know on the collective advocacy side, what's your view from there?
Thanks, Justin. So yeah, I'd like to look a little bit at the angle of advocacy and policy changing. Our members, and that's many of you in the room have been extremely active on Yemen in the past 2 or 3 years. It's been a real collective effort, so I want to recognize that and the strength of that. First of all, I think when the conflict started, the advocacy and the work that we did on Yemen was very much traditional humanitarian advocacy. Talking to policymakers and decision makers to make sure that they knew what the situation on the ground was like, ensuring that there was proper funding to respond. When there were risks of famine a couple of years back, really conveying that message and ensuring that again, awareness and resources were available. So very traditional advocacy work to some extent from our perspective. So because we're based in Washington, a lot of it happening in Washington, but also as part of the Interagency Standing Committee, also happening with colleagues from UN organizations. I think what we realized very quickly, and Arif to some extent alluded to that, was that the humanitarian assistance, as good or as perfect or as big as it was actually a drop in the bucket. And so the advocacy and our positioning changed a little bit, and this is where we focused a lot, almost on a single issue for a long time, which was the port of Odessa, because the analysis was, we can do all we want, but if this port where, and the figures, Arif, the majority of the goods come in the country is closed by the conflict or by warring parties, then basically all that we are going to do is going to be completely ineffective. So not only essential for humanitarian goods to come in, but also for the private sector goods to come in. And so that became really almost the sole focus of our advocacy, is making sure that all the policymakers, decision makers were aware that the crux of the conflict was the port of Udaydah. And in that sense, it has been a success. I mean, Liz Gon, the humanitarian coordinator in Yemen, basically says without the collective advocacy that happened, Udaydah probably would have been taken by now. So, which is a recognition of, to some extent, of the effectiveness of the work that we've been doing. At the same time, we have to recognize the limitations that we have, because as Inge mentioned, this is a very politicized conflict. And our main donors, the main donors, are also the main, or if not the main, supporting parties to the conflict. So very complicated to navigate this. So be it the UK, the US, the France, in terms of supporting the military effort, the Saudi government itself being a donor of the humanitarian response, and of course the main perpetrator, all these very difficult situations to navigate, that we had to recognize the limitations that we had. We thought that we were doing excellent advocacy in terms of certifying certain actions, etc. But from the DC level, basically, the arms lobby was who we were against. And so we have to recognize that as collectively good and morally right as we were, we lost some of that battle. But that's another opportunity to continue that fight. And I think this is the frustration of the work. We're making, I think, tremendous difference on the ground, but at the same time, the political environment is such that it becomes very complicated to get to where we really want, which means a change for the people that are bearing the brunt of the conflict. The Stockholm meeting is happening today, so we can be hopeful that the peace talks will lead to something. At the same time, our understanding is if it doesn't lead to anything, the conflict is only going to accelerate and multiply, and the sheer power of military weapons is going to be felt and heard in Udaydah and everywhere else in Yemen. We do continue to do more classic humanitarian advocacy, and that was mentioned by my two co-panelists, around access, and especially around very bureaucratic impediments that especially NGOs are subject to, regarding visas, regarding authorizations to operate, to program, etc., which are becoming more and more difficult to navigate. So I think as we're here, hosted by WFP, I think one thing to say also is the Yemen crisis also is illustrated, I think, some of the comparative advantages in terms of advocacy, both of the UN on one side and of civil societies and NGOs on the other. I think both in DC with ourselves, but also in London, in Paris, there's been a lot of efforts to influence governments that are to some level related to the conflict, and that's been very effective. I think in country and in the region, the UN architecture, the humanitarian coordinator, the special envoy, etc., have been very useful in terms of facilitating or defending some of the issues around humanitarian principles, around humanitarian access, etc. And I think this combination, if there is a lesson learned, is the most effective to leverage the power of civil society and leverage the multilateral power that the UN has in those circumstances. To conclude, I think and I think it's probably going to be a thread in the three panels. This is eminently, of course, a political problem. It's got a political solution, and we as humanitarians are thrown in there, and we need to ensure that humanitarian diplomacy is front and center of our efforts, and that humanitarian considerations are taken into account in those political conversations. So I'll leave it at that.
So, fabulous. What a treat of 3 different perspectives. We're going to spend the next 15, 20 minutes interacting with you as a panel on some of these issues before we then switch over to Bangladesh and Syria, and then we'll have a time of engagement with the whole room on the common and maybe different themes and learnings that come out. But for the next little bit, I want to kind of pull out some of the things that we've heard here and what do they mean for us in terms of learning. So let me start with one of those. So what I hear access in a number of contexts, and the need to scale up, the need to get access, and particularly also the changing context. Say the port of Hodeidah, for example, and which results from potentially advocacy being effective or not being effective. Inge, do you mind if I ask you how operationally do you navigate the uncertainties of that? The change, suddenly something is hopeful and then it's not. Suddenly there is an opportunity to expand access and then it's closed. Or there's uncertainty that it may be there and it's not. You have to actually put that into operational planning reality in terms of, logistics, in terms of funding, in terms of people. How do you do that in a constantly challenging, changing, evolving environment that can open and close because of factors that are outside your hands?
Okay, we swap mic. Thank you. Well, let me give you one example, what we've done in terms of preparedness. As you may know, there has been a lot of work done on the IPC, and the IPC results are coming out now. But we decided in WFP we're not going to wait for the results to be out before we get into action. And so it was already like a month ago that we had initial discussions, including with Arif, to see what to do about the situation. There was a lot of discussion also with our supply chain colleagues, also keeping in mind that there are not many vessels at the moment calling on Hodeidah port because of all the hostilities in Hodeidah city. There are still some on Salif port, the other Red Sea port, but it's very, very limited. So many are diverting. Many vessels are going to Aden port. Aden port is completely congested, and it's really going to it's becoming a major bottleneck for getting supplies in. So what we've done with our supply chain colleagues, we've opened another corridor coming in through Salalah port, through Oman to get supplies in there. And that means not just sending vessels there, but also having milling facilities in Salalah port. We are also having an assessment team in Saudi Arabia at the moment. We have waited for a very long time because of the political sensitivities to activate that, but there are colleagues out there now to see in how far, perhaps, if the situation were to warrant, we could also activate a corridor from that end. That just to be sure that at all times we have enough food supplies in the country to assist the 8 million people or 12 million people that without our assistance would face the risk of starvation. And we have at this point in time, for example, some 180,000 tons in country. And if I say 180,000 tons, you have to compare that with some 106,000 tons that we have distributed for the month of November. So the aim is to have at every point in time always a 1 month supply in the country to have food available in case everything gets shut down completely. Yeah, so it's then there is of course a lot of negotiation going on with both sides of the conflict, right? Internally, and if I say both sides, it's not just two sides, because sometimes that's even within one authority there are people with different views, and you have to speak with all those who have a different view to make sure they can agree among themselves, and it's an agreement that will help you to do your work. So there's a lot of negotiation going on at all points in time, while, as I said, while we need to make sure that we always have enough supplies in the country to keep going. What we've also done, for example, in Hodeidah city, There were, before the latest escalation of conflict in June, there were around 600,000 people in Hodeidah city. By now, there are only like around a third left. So what we've done for Hodeidah city, we've done what we call blanket distributions, protection distributions, to assist basically everybody. We no longer do household targeting. We assume everybody is in the same need because everybody is in that city that is affected by siege, so we assist them on a monthly basis. We don't wait until things get very dire. We start before they get worse. I hope that answers your question.
Fantastic examples there. I'll stay with you for one follow-up, if that's okay. So we heard about humanitarian diplomacy, and that we're talking about at the higher levels. But what I hear from you, Inge, is that the humanitarian diplomacy is needed also at the grassroots in terms of negotiating with different actors, at the very local level. What are the capabilities that a humanitarian organization needs differently in those contested situations, whether it's a UN agency such as WFP or some of the civil society organizations? What helps us to do that well, that negotiation at the front line of between three different actors to get access to a place that you did not have last week, or where there's a new actor comes into play? What capabilities, what do we need to do differently as a humanitarian sector in order to manage that humanitarian negotiation at the very grassroots level? What has helped and what has hindered?
Yeah, I think we always praise ourselves in WFP. We say, we deliver, we do. You need people on the ground who understand, who can analyze the situation. People like Arif, not that Arif is not a doer, Arif is a doer, but people who really understand what's going on. And then you need people on the ground who can liaise and interface with the different actors, people who speak their language, people who have their trust. And that cannot just be one person. Sometimes we rely a lot on local staff, a lot on national staff that give us a lot of intelligence to understand what's happening on the ground. We rely a lot on our partners because they're really at the grassroots level. They have sometimes an understanding that we don't have. And then, of course, the humanitarian coordinator plays an incredibly important role to advocate with the authorities on the ground. And then also at times, since it's a conflict with a regional, with an international dimension, it's also liaising with certain countries so that they, from their end, can put pressure on the decision makers. That helps us open doors. So it's really a primary example, Yemen, where you need collective action, a collective understanding, a collective analysis. You need to prioritize among yourselves and you need to agree how you proceed, and then to make that happen through the diplomacy. Thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm going to ask then over to Arif, if that's okay, and I'll come back to a civil society perspective afterwards. So those trade-offs, those decisions that you have to make locally, as a UN agency, you work at the behest of member states, including those that are parties to the conflict, or at least allied to parties to the conflict. The challenge in terms of humanitarian principles and that reality, could you give us a flavor of what is that like on a, at your level, Arif, as you're giving guidance to actors, you're dealing with central banks that are, part of, with both sides probably of the conflict. How do you navigate that territory where your humanitarian principles and those choices, those different actors are there at the more macro level, whether at country level or even influencing globally?
Okay, so honest answer?
We have been live streamed here, so but no, absolutely.
I think when two parties are fighting, you have to, in a way, show them why your action is better for both of them. Because you cannot favor one, because they're fighting. Why should they let you assist their people and not this side or vice versa, regardless of whether there is need or not, right? So, case in point, this right now financial crisis. My talk with, or our talk with on both sides was that if you don't sort this out, it is equally bad for both sides. Why? Because it's your people who are suffering from the same thing, and on the other side also people are suffering from the same thing. So if the currency keeps going, you're going to be in trouble as well, regardless on which side you are. And that understanding, you need to know what you're talking about in terms of conveying that understanding. The second thing which is important, I think Inge remembers last time I was there, we had shortage of assistance, so we couldn't really give what we had said to the populations which we were supposed to target. So we said, okay, what we're going to do is we are going to give the assistance to the most needy within those. And when we got to those places, they said, no way. Even if you give 1/3 of what you're going to give, you got to give it to everyone. It's like one governorate, 2 governorates, 3 governorates, from what I recall. And it's like, well, if you give it to anyone, you're not benefiting anyone because it's not enough to make a dent. And sitting there, it just was, I said, it was like 40, 50 people, big table around all of these guys sitting, and everybody's shouting, and I said, do you know what zakat is? And zakat is the Muslim 2.5% on your savings. You give the alm. Yes, of course we know what zakat is. Okay, so do you give zakat to everyone? No, just the most needy. I said, think of this assistance as zakat. And for at least 5 minutes, everybody was quiet. Why do I mention this? The reason is, knowing the context and the culture of the people you're dealing with is really important if you're going to convince them. Because if you don't, you're just an outsider, you're coming there to give assistance, you have deep pockets, why shouldn't they ask for everything? That's inside the country. Outside the country, I think everybody has heard my executive director. I mean, he calls it as he sees it, and regardless of who is doing what, he calls it, and he calls it out loud, and I think that has been pretty beneficial for all of us in terms of raising or putting the light on the most critical issues, whether they were internal to Yemen or external to Yemen. And I think that has been something which has also helped us quite a bit.
Arif, thank you. As someone who works for a faith-based humanitarian organization myself, the bridging of your humanitarian principles into a faith-based context and making that real through the example you've given on zakat, I just think that's a really powerful way of bridging what is sometimes a gap that is, not a real gap, actually. It's a gap of language more than of humanity. And I often think that finding that place of common humanity, whether it's at the political level or can often be the most powerful thing.
And the other thing is, which you hope will always work, is connecting people through children. I think for us, on this mission, the most troubling thing, if you will, was looking at the deterioration in the state of children in the same places for me where I went a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, the Sana'a hospital. And while Edie was doing his rounds, I was, I was talking to people, and one thing which came out was that there were about 50 children coming. This is the biggest hospital in Sana'a. So there were about 50 children coming into the hospital every day, SAM kids, of which 20 were being admitted, and 30 were being sent back because the doctor, the main doctor, said we just don't have the resources to accommodate everybody. And my question was, as an analyst, you always are comparing it to what was in the past. I said, so how many were you getting before? He says, and I quote, that we didn't even have this ward before the war. And I buy that. If people who know Yemen, they would accept that. Now, why was that the case? Why is so many kids coming? Because it's the last, and they were coming from different places, not from Sana'a alone, right? So from Hodeidah, from other places. And this is like the last step which people are taking before they're seeing their kid die in front of them. Now, the tragic part of all of this is that by the time most of the kids who come there, they're already half dead, if not more. So the trick is, how can we go back and get into places before kids get to this state? And this is what we need to push for. And this is the story we need to tell both sides. Nobody wants to see their children dying or others' children dying. So that's another venue. Again, I mean, you need to know whether you're in Yemen or you're in South Sudan or any elsewhere. You need to know what you're dealing with. You need to be really clean on the humanitarian principles, because that is what then builds your trust. They may say, oh, he's a bad guy, but he's an honest guy. He's not doing enough for us, but he's right. They may be begrudging about it, but they will do it. Thank you.
Arif, thank you. Again, such a powerful elaboration of when coping strategies reach their limit. And let me go to Julien. From a civil society perspective, when we're working as NGOs, whether it's international NGOs or whether that's working with local partners, navigating that political territory, the choice of what type of collective advocacy you do on the bureaucratic impediments that we face to enable good operations versus sometimes the moral high ground that we can take because we're not a party to the conflict, and so we can be tempted to throw rocks at those that are. How do you navigate that, to be constructive, to be straightforward and honest? We're not, obliged to follow a single member state or, how do you navigate that territory, have you found, and also especially in the membership organization, that interaction?
Well, I think we need to focus on operations. I mean, at the end of the day, from an interaction perspective, we're not a human rights, or we're not there to denounce. We're there to provide assistance to the people in a principled way. That is the credibility that we have, and so using the operational realities, I see our role as a network in a capital as bringing the operational realities from our members to the policy and political tables, so it is part and parcel of the knowledge of the situation. Otherwise, other interests and other priorities will always take precedence. So even if it is, almost to provide almost some guilt to those people, that is our role. It's pretentious to say that we represent the people on the ground. We don't, but by the same token, we are the closest, especially as NGOs and civil societies, to the people that are suffering. So it is our duty to bring that to the conversation. And again, with the theme of the conversations this morning, really putting the affected people at the center and trying as best as we can to represent some of their issues. But to go back to your question, I think we need to be pragmatic. It is not about NGOs getting on their soapbox and being holier than thou. It is about focusing our advocacy pragmatically on what can improve the operations on the ground. And that's a collective endeavor. And I think this is where it's important to have a common understanding, as Inge was saying, and a common plan, because if we don't, in very complex situations like Yemen with very strong governments or de facto governments or or warring parties, they're going to pick us off if we're not united. And we've seen that happen time and time again in some contexts. So we have to be pragmatic, but really principled. Otherwise, we're just going to be picked off and weakened.
So, really clean to our humanitarian principles, but pragmatic, and we have to make a difference to the operations. I'm sure that the conversation this afternoon on Yemen will stay with us. I'm sure many of you in the room will have experiences directly, which we'll have a chance to reflect on as a bit later this afternoon as we engage on all three contexts. I think it's now time for our break. If I'm right, if Bettina or anyone tells me wrong, but I think we have until 1:30 to go take some coffee. Carry this into your conversations over coffee, and get prepared to shift your head to the south of Bangladesh and the border with Myanmar, and then to the complex situation of Syria. And then we'll have some learning from all of this. We'll hopefully get some of your learning out as well. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for a fantastic panel.
Thank you so much. Another fantastic panel with people who really move the world, not just people, but change the world. So thank you for that. And drink the coffee a little bit faster. We give you 15 minutes to get caffeinated. So it would be great if you're back here in like 15 minutes. Good afternoon. I hope everybody got enough coffee and cakes and sandwiches and all kinds of other things that the Italians are eating right after lunch. We have another important session, so maybe come around, have a seat, check out, and now it's over to serious business again.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Getting us in and out for coffee within 15 minutes was a tall order, but we have something worth coming back for. To go from Sana'a and the situation in Yemen, now we are moving down towards the Teknaf River on the border of Bangladesh and Myanmar, and three fantastic panelists joining me here to look at the situation of the refugees there. Let me just do a couple of words of introduction, and then we'll get into the contents. So first, Mark Pearce is the country director of Save the Children in Bangladesh for the last 2.5 years, I think. But he'd been working in Asia for 25 years. And in fact, actually, we worked together in Cambodia when we were both much younger. A long time ago. So, but you've been country director in Vietnam, Cambodia, Philippines, and Egypt as well. You're also working not just with Save the Children now, but with obviously with other NGOs in the past, but also as co-chair of Start Fund, of the Start Fund in Bangladesh, and as a member of the Strategic Executive Group for the Rohingya Response, and on the advisory board for Impact Investing Bangladesh. So a fascinating array of experience. And then on your left is Janerose Alvers, here with World Food Programme, but based in Dhaka, head of external relations and communications, with over 20 years of experience across a number of areas, including information management, monitoring and evaluation, accountability to effective populations, project planning and management from Kenya, Uganda, and Sweden, as well as now Bangladesh. Now, one of the things that's fascinating is you were responsible for refugee management for the city of Gothenburg in Sweden during the migration crisis, it was called, whether it was or not is a moot point, for there, and went straight from managing that in Sweden to a different type of refugee crisis in Bangladesh. So I'm sure we'll bring a fascinating perspective, James. It's great to have you on the panel. And then Lewis Temple, the Chief Executive Officer for BRAC in the UK. And I think, as all of you know, BRAC is, I would say, I can't think of another NGO that has been born out of the global south that has become a global international NGO with real influence and impact in multiple countries. And you lead the office in the UK, and you've worked for over 20 years in international development, not just with BRAC, but at country and regional level in Central Asia, in Africa, and previously with the NGO IDE, which was income and livelihood opportunities for poorer rural households across the world. So I think you'll agree, a fabulous array of experience. Again, both NGO, local NGO, and World Food Programme. So, Mark, would you take us all the way from Yemen and from Rome to Dhaka and to Cox's Bazar? Give us an insight into the challenges and opportunities we have there.
All right, thank you, Justin, and for that introduction. Yeah, so let me paint the picture a little bit so you understand the context. One is the Rohingya crisis in Bangladesh is a decades-long problem. It is, some people have been displaced 4 times since the 1970s, and periodically over these decades, 200 to 300 to 400,000 people have been going back and forth between Myanmar and Bangladesh, and as you know, they're one of the most persecuted people in the world. And the other thing is to be aware of is that in 2016, actually 10 months before this massive exodus, we had a very similar situation that occurred in Bangladesh, which was there was a small, let's say, militant group that attacked police stations, and that led to the response from the Myanmar military, and 80,000 people crossed in 2016, 10 months before the major crisis. And I say that because many of us, UN agencies, there was about 5 international NGOs, we were already preparing, we were responding to the current crisis with some 350,000 plus 80,000 new people coming. So we're already making preparations for this influx. And maybe that's my first point, is when we get to what went right and what went wrong here, was that one of the lessons from this crisis was the good responses. Good responses start with very good preparedness planning that are going on months and years before the event occurred. And had we not already been on the ground, had we not been preparing for influx, we would have been very far behind the 8 ball on this response. The second thing was in August 25th, 2017, you have to understand, do we have it? You have it here. Wow, yeah, okay, so you have a sense. I was there, I was getting phone calls on August 25th every day, and there were thousands of people. And let me give you the numbers of what was happening. I have it here. August 27th, 5,200 people came across. By September 7th, a week later, it was 270,000. By September 28th, now 1 month later, it was 521,000 had come across in 1 month. So we were dealing with the fastest refugee influx ever. And they all came into this camp. And people came in, they were hungry, they were exhausted, they were sick, and they were traumatized. And they would tell you, they said, at least we're alive. Because 10,000, at least 10,000 were killed on the other side in Myanmar from the violence that occurred. So you've got to understand. And at one point, as you could imagine, in this September, we collectively, it was the UN and some of the INGOs, there was about 12 of us, 15 of us, we collectively realized this is out of control, and that's when panic sets in, because this is way beyond your capacity to respond. And I would say it was the government of Bangladesh that agreed to accept eventually 1 million refugees coming in, the host communities that actually were the first responders, and it was WFP and the NGO community that all collectively turned what could have been a colossal failure into a success story. And so that's probably one of the things I wanted to say, was that group, that whole group of all the various stakeholders really made a difference. And why is that? There was a couple things. One was obviously preparedness, is what I said before. There were plans in place, there was pre-positioning of supplies from all the actors, and there was good coordination that was taking place even before the crisis took place on August 25th. Second, we were fortunate that despite what you might hear about the government of Bangladesh being difficult and this and that, we had good cooperation. Good cooperation with the government. They were on our side. They had their own issues, but they were on our side. But there was good cooperation with government of Bangladesh, the host communities, donors, NGOs. Bangladesh, while it's a big country, it's a fairly small humanitarian community, and we're all on the same page. And so you weren't feeling like you were fighting against the donors or the government. 3, and I give credit to WFP, WFP was agile and was able to make decisions very quickly. It knew what to do, it made decisions, it moved on, it worked with the players who knew what they were doing, because there were 5 or 6 NGOs who were there. I know Solidarity was one of them over here, and Handicap International, MSF. There were certain players who are on the ground doing a great job. ACF is another one I didn't mention, and BRAC. And then the other thing is that you have to understand the Rohingya themselves are very resilient people. They have been, how do I say it? They have been, if I may say it in group, they've been shitted on for so many years that they were able to manage, and they were able to respond and they get on with their business. And even today, you would say, if you go into the camps, people are moving on. So that's kind of some of the good stories. But let me talk about the challenges, and then I'll finish. One, access has been a huge problem, as it was said before. But we had problems on access, both in terms of the fact that most of the assistance came from the east, when in fact the camps to the west were 2 to 3 hours walk away. And so you couldn't get assistance out to all people, and so that was a problem. We overcame it over months, but that was one of our big group problems. The other problem, in which I think we were all at fault, is really making sure the most marginalized were being reached. And while we focused a lot on unaccompanied and separated children, there were about 6,000 that were in that situation, but the reaching people with disabilities, the aged, female-head households were really, really a big problem in terms of making sure that the benefits were accruing to them as well. And then, of course, government restrictions that limited what we could do. You have to understand that Cox's Bazar was a restricted travel destination. You couldn't just, before August 25th, you couldn't just go there. Even Bangladeshis couldn't just go there. So that's been a perennial problem, and the government has legitimate reasons to be concerned, and I'll get to that in a minute. Other challenge right now is, some of you may say, well, why are we still doing general food distribution a year later? And that's because the government of Bangladesh has limited cash. They don't want any cash distribution. They don't want any livelihoods. So making the Rohingya more self-reliant by letting them do some type of income-generating activities is not an option. And that's for 2 principal reasons that I understand. One is cash allows the Rohingya to buy their way out of the problem. They could migrate, they could get passports or whatever. It allows them more mobility. There's a second issue, which I guess our economist would appreciate, is the central bank is concerned about cash getting into the economy, perhaps $6 million a month if you were giving cash instead of food, and there's an impact in terms of the local economy. Our other risks and challenge here is having the risk of a crisis within a crisis. And we've dodged a couple bullets, if I may say. We were very concerned at the very beginning about cholera, because if you saw the sanitation problems, you would understand. The sanitation, water was polluted, it was really bad. So we all thought cholera was going to be the next crisis. In fact, what happened was diphtheria became the problem. Who ever thought of diphtheria becoming a problem, except in Yemen? And so we had to respond to diphtheria. I forget, there were 30, 40, 50 cases, but 4,000 people affected, so that was one of the crises. But we still have crisis around risk of a cyclone, and this is a cyclone-prone area. We have refoulement, or forced relocation back to Myanmar, or relocation to an island. We have the risk of extremism, and we have, obviously, and if I may say, there is an ongoing problem right now in terms of increasing number of Rohingya that are fleeing by boat, because this is the dry season, and if you look on news, there's movement to Indonesia and Thailand. Other challenges around right now that this is a protracted crisis. This is going to go on. I would say, if you ask me, the next 7 to 10 years. There's no easy solution here, so therefore, how do we bring the cost of this response down? It's a cost close to $1 billion a year. The food assistance alone is $250 million. And then the last problem, or the last challenge, I would say, is durable solutions. I don't know what Janerose will say, but from my perspective, we don't see a solution. We don't see any realistic solution here. We'll get into that maybe in the discussions. This is not just a humanitarian crisis, it's a political crisis because the solution is in the politics between Bangladesh, Myanmar, the region of ASEAN and Bangladesh, as well as the geopolitics with China, Russia, India, US, all involved. Thank you.
I just want to add on to what Mark has said. WFP is supporting close to 1 million people. And as you said, there's a political solution to this. But in the meantime, we are grappling with trying to feed almost 1 million people a month, which translates to around about 700, three-quarters of that is general food distributions. The other quarter is in e-vouchers. And we are moving towards e-vouchers because, as he said, the government does not allow cash. And that is it's a problem for all the agencies and also for the World Food Program because it means that we have to provide these people with a very limited number of food communities. We are trying to give them a nutritious diet that is based on 21 kilocalories, and with the e-vouchers, giving them 18 food commodities that they can choose. That gives them dignity, choice, a nutritious diet. But we would like to transition everyone to e-vouchers. So one of the things that WFP did at the beginning of the crisis, realizing that this is massive, because the influx, as you said, with the 80% of the population arrived within 2.5 months. 80%. You've seen the massiveness of the camp. One thing you must realize is that the mega camp that you see there it's the fourth most densely populated, say, city in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is one of the most densely populated countries in the whole world. This camp is only 3,500 acres of land. The density of the population is bigger than, it's as big as Milan for only in that acreage. So WFP, the first thing they did was that we registered everybody onto a Schopp, which is the beneficiary management system. And the only way to do that was to be able to capture everybody that needs our assistance. And with the support of our partners, it was possible. And as you say, this is it was a large and fast refugee influx. So the only way for us to minimize, because realizing that, giving people cards, paper cards, the risks of double dipping, were there. And the only way to make sure that everybody, was accounted for, everybody was supported with their needs, was to register everybody. And that has been a saving grace, because with the Schopp card, and also the possibility of having a multi-wallet, it was possible for even other agencies to be able to use this to reach beneficiaries. Far-flung. One thing that Mark mentioned was with access. WFP is working together with its partners to be able to open up access in the most remote areas within the camp, cutting down hills, stabilizing hills, moving people from densely, like this kind of, densely populated area that is quite risky, to more stable land, not as densely populated. And that has been done together with IOM and UNHCR, and also together with local partners. In all this, looking at, there is 55% of the population are women, and around about 52% are women and 55% are children. The Schopp card, I can say, is being given to women, the women. They are the ones who are responsible for the cooking in every home. And WFP is focusing on giving women the voice. And by that, we are thinking about a gender and protective perspective. Because apart from the card being given to the women, the ones who are most vulnerable, who are having GFD, they are given, there's a porter system in place. And we're talking about protection. We give the women one card and we give the porter one card. It's a token. So when they transport the food to their homes, they then give the token to the porter to make sure that they actually deliver the food all the way home. Because these are women who are maybe pregnant, they're disabled, and to make sure that they actually get the support they need, that is the only way we could do it. And I think it has worked very well together with our partners. Also, some of the things that we still do, and we did in the beginning, was to have wet kitchens together with our partners. And it's still ongoing at a small scale, because we still have people continuously coming in, and there is people who are also who do not have the capacity and possibility to cook for themselves. One of the things that we realized is that, as Mark said, there was a risk of an emergency within emergency. We managed to avoid cyclone, but we are aware that the cyclone season is coming. Looking at the magnitude of this camp, it's so big. The WFP, together with partners, are having contingency measures in place to be able to avert a disaster within a disaster. And that is, we're doing prepositioning, we are strengthening slopes, we are moving people from disaster-prone areas, and also we're supporting the host community with refurbishing the cyclone shelters. One thing that is quite important to mention in this crisis was that apart from the agility of WFP and its partners, there was, because of there's no, OCHA doesn't exist in Cox's Bazar. The agencies had to have a coordination mechanism that worked for them, homegrown, together with the NGOs, the government, the UN agencies, something called ISG. And because of that, there was also the need to provide parallel systems in place, because to be able to support both the host community and the refugees. The host community in Cox's Bazar are just as vulnerable as the refugee population. And because most of the partners were already in place because of the influx before, and because most of the Rohingyas, because of the successive influxes, have been embedded into the host communities, there was a need to support not just the refugee population, but also the host community. Mm-hmm. So I think in that way we could avoid all the administrative hiccups, because there was no OCHA, and UNHCR did not have its mandate. There was also this, while everybody was trying to decide how are we going to manage between IOM and UNHCR, all the partners were looking at a people-centered, needs-based perspective by supporting them with the right interventions. One thing, that collaboration has really been impactful, because we've been able to prepare well, with all its challenges, of course. We are also looking together with partners on synergies between our programs, moving from life-saving to self-reliance activities and livelihoods for host communities. As you heard, the government of Bangladesh does not allow, you could say, livelihoods activities to be considered in the camps. We're allowed to say self-reliance sometimes, but mostly we are told we have to say empowerment, life skills training and all of that. But we know that there is a need for this population to move from dependency to some kind of livelihoods or self-reliance activities. We know that donor fatigue will set in sometime, and we're all working towards finding a solution for that. Even even if the government says that we're not really allowed to have cash, but we have to do something about it. But we are working towards, finding cash for work activities, DRR activities, women centers that are providing skills training. All of those activities are geared towards giving them some kind of life skills and self-reliance activities. That gives us the possibility to also, maybe in the long term, start targeting, because when we move everybody onto e-vouchers, which we hope to do in the coming year, maybe by mid-year, we will then be able to have the possibility, because everybody's registered and everybody is on scope. Maybe the last thing I want to mention is the role of the World Bank in Bangladesh. That is something that is quite important to mention, because coming in, we're working together with the World Bank to have a resilient camp, and also it's public works, and at the same time to have a community services for the refugee population, and hope that it will also translate into the host community.
Thank you very much. So, resilience, I'm sure with BRAC it will be a good link to yourself.
Thank you. Thank you, Justin. So we were very much hoping that my colleague from Bangladesh was going to come here today, Murshad. Unfortunately, he didn't get a visa for Italy, which perhaps talks to some of the themes I'm going to briefly mention shortly about localization and participation of local organizations in humanitarian response. You'll remember in 2016, the grand bargain from the World Humanitarian Summit was that 25% of humanitarian resources would go to local organizations. There we are, 2017, with a Rohingya crisis. We've actually seen it happen, certainly with BRAC, which is the largest responder in Cox's Bazar in the camps. It's a Bangladeshi organization, was already working in those areas and had been there for 35 years. So it was a relatively straightforward process of adding on to that capacity that was already through programs and offices in the Cox's Bazar area. So it was relatively straightforward. So one of the key points I'd like to make is when you're thinking of a response to a new emergency, start local. Start with the capacity that's on the ground already. And we've seen with the Cox's Bazar situation, not only the local NGOs, but also the capacity of the government has been a very important factor in the ability to respond and provide for the needs of such a large population. But also, like Janerose was saying, the support should also go not just to the refugees, but also for the host community. And that goes for programming and also where you employ and so on. So BRAC has 4,200 people working in the camps, of which 1,600 are sourced from the Rohingya community themselves, and 1,900 from the host community. So, very much providing employment and opportunities for the refugees themselves and for the host community to address the problems that Janerose are talking about with extreme poverty in the host community as well as the refugee community. But in many situations, BRAC is quite unusual. It's a Bangladesh organization that has gone global. It's now working in 10 other countries around the world quite successfully, and has a very significant capacity in Bangladesh. But the question I'd like to ask is, where are the other BRACs? Where are the BRACs in Yemen, in Syria, and so on, the organizations with such capacity? And maybe that's, as international organizations, that's what we should also be thinking about. How can we support to develop local civil society capacity? And I'll tell you a little story. A couple of years ago at a board meeting in Bangladesh, our head of finance showed BRAC's first funding contract from 1972, and that was from Oxfam UK. So Oxfam played a really important role in the founding of BRAC, and look where we are today, an organization like BRAC, with a turnover of $1 billion in Bangladesh, where it's nearly 80% self-financed from its own businesses and social enterprises in the country, and able to respond to such a way to this crisis in Cox's Bazar. So, let's see how we can replicate that experience in other parts of the world. I think we're running short of time, so I'll draw a line there and perhaps respond to questions as they come up.
Lewis, thank you. Thank you, all three of you. So and thank you, WFP, for the fabulous footage of the background. So we've heard preparedness, we've heard panic, we've heard some of the transition in terms of the modalities, in terms of food, in terms of cash, and then we've heard a call for local. I like that, where is the BRACs in Syria and Yemen? Well, let's go to Syria. We'll hold the questions and thoughts around Bangladesh for at the end of the panel, and we're going to invite up our two colleagues and panelists from Syria response now. If you stay by in your panelist table, we haven't finished with you yet. Thank you very much. So, as they're coming up, perhaps I will use the time just to introduce. We have first up in front coming up, Khaled Erksoussi is the Secretary General of the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, where he's worked since 1991. Fabulous. With many roles, including Vice President and Secretary of the Damascus Board, and in 2014 was Coordinator of Humanitarian Diplomacy. This is not the first time we've heard that subject mentioned today, for IFRC in Beirut, and then also Coordinator of International Movement and Partnership in the Office of IFRC in Syria. Khaled, welcome. We're going to hear from you in just a second. And after that, we'll hear from Ahmed Zakaria, here from World Food Programme, Head of World Food Programme in Syria, has also worked with a donor, USAID, and with an NGO, CARE, before joining WFP back in 1999, as well as working for the UNDP in Sudan. Many countries in Asia, Africa, Middle East, Canada, and Papua New Guinea. What a fabulous portfolio of things. So, Khaled, take us back to the Middle East, and take us from Bangladesh to Syria.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure, and I have to say it's my first time here in this APC and this event. So thank you. Well, as you know, Syria, it's now the 8th year in the conflict or in the crisis that's going on. SARC is the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, is in fact in the middle of the humanitarian response to the crisis. It has a lot of partners. In fact, SARC is the implementing partner of, I would have to say, all of the UN agencies, the WFP, the UNHCR, WHO, you name it. In the beginning of the crisis, SARC, in fact, was the implementing partner, the sole implementing partner of WFP, receiving 100% of whatever WFP was bringing to Syria. That's 2011 and 2012. Now, with the scene expanding, the humanitarian scene expanding, WFP has more partners as NGOs and charities. SARC is still the biggest partner, now implementing at least 40% of what WFP is bringing to the country. To make you understand a little bit about what is the situation in Syria, there's a lot of changes through the years. What I was hearing in the panel of Yemen, for instance, very similar to what we had 3 or 4 years ago, maybe in Syria, with the big difference that in Syria, there is still a government recognized by the UN. And there is still authorities and there's still approvals that need to be taken to gain access to areas. Now, through this year, maybe, all the reports indicate there is now 0 areas under siege in Syria. So there is no more under siege areas. But there is still hard to reach areas. And hard to reach areas are areas who require approvals for access because of the limited access. explaining a little bit about SARC. SARC is a volunteer-based organization. It was built on volunteers. I come as 28 years as a volunteer of SARC, so I know a lot about the organization. And the core of the organization is this 9,762 volunteers who are all around Syria, from the villages and from the cities, and those people are around the country, and they continue to be around the country. So the word access, in fact, for us as local doers, as it was mentioned, is very different. Because access for us is the humanitarian aid reaching us in the areas where we live. And the danger on the volunteers and the safety and security issues is also very different. Because, I mean, my challenge, for instance, from 2011 till 2014, when I was the head of operation, it wasn't finding people to go to places. It was stopping people from going to places. That's the issue. And for that, the term access, it needs to be really discussed between local partners and the UN agencies. Because when they say, for instance, that agency UN XYZ doesn't have access, and on the other hand, my volunteers is on the other side waiting for the boxes or the aid to come, and they have access, but they don't have the aid. So that's an issue that needs to be also discussed. And when they report, for instance, that we cannot reach this area while the local partner can reach this area. So we need also to discuss whether do we need to reach that area as international agencies, or do we need the aid to reach that area through a local partner? That also was discussing. A lot of issues that also nowadays, for instance, is also under discussion, for instance, for SARC. Now the conflict is on the 8th, it's on the 8th year. A lot of the government, ministries, and agencies, they think that, well, now the crisis is behind them. So there is a lot of services that they would like to take over, to get back to their hand. So SARC, in fact, is now considered as a competitor for some of the governmental agencies or ministries. Each time we get an ambulance, for instance, or try to get an ambulance inside the country, we have this discussion with the Ministry of Health. Why do you need 100 ambulances? Why do you need 110 ambulances? Our response is, in fact, our plan is to have 300 ambulances. Because compared to neighboring countries, compared to the response, compared to the plans, and it's not our problem that nobody is donating ambulances to you. We cannot force our partners to like you. I mean, we are an impartial and neutral organization, and we thrive on that. And the core of those volunteers, those 9,000, in fact, they are the force behind that. They are the force behind that, meaning that you cannot force something on them which is not according to the principles. The government tried to do that in 2011. In 2011, the first letter we received as an organization, it was in April 2011, saying, you don't move a muscle until we say so. And the funny thing was, the reason behind that was because you have the auxiliary role. I mean, they can twist also the thing according to what is. So what was our decision back then as volunteers was, if we want to enforce this, then the organization will split, because the volunteers will not follow, and the ambulances will still move. So we will have to consider and to explain and to do our humanitarian diplomacy with the authorities and with the other parties, that we are allowed to be this humanitarian and impartial partner. And this is for the raison d'etat of the Syria. And that in fact proved correct, because at the end, after 8 years, the only partner who is a civil society organization who we need all to preserve is the Syrian Arab Red Crescent. And without the support of the international partners and the support of the UN agencies and the INGOs, this civil society organization will cease to exist, because now it's in the middle of the pressure between the authorities and some nagging who we still hear sometimes from outside. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Khaled, and thanks, our moderator. When I first arrived in Syria, 2000 plus year back, by that time I had more than 20 years, different countries in the world, similar situation in the past. But then Syria, what I started learning many new things. And in the humanitarian context or development context, whatever you can think of a country challenge provides, there were all elements were there. For example, I heard about cross lines, cross-border, hard-to-reach area, besieged area. Then you have massive supply chain for the packaging was established. Then you have, of course, permission required to reach anywhere, UN convoys, so all these. Now, from there, have Syria moved forward? Have Syria made progress? Absolutely. Example, when we all international staff stay in a hotel, and when I first came there, every other night or day, there will be plane flying, fighting going on, smoking right there. You can see through your window. Actually, a meeting room will be hit by a shrapnel. Some people are narrowly escaped. And of course, those things are no longer there. And other changes, the airdrop no longer there, the airlifting no longer there, hard to reach area or besieged area become, at one point it was 20, now it is 0. There is no besieged area in the country. And hard to reach area, of course, has also reduced. The question is, has the conflict stopped? No, all of you know there are two major areas still there. One is Idlib, and one is the Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. Huge challenges. What's going to happen? We don't know. Again, as our earlier panelist says, it's a higher level political big issues to be solved before it can happen. Now, in other places, when, in terms of access and reaching population we have been talking about, you know, in the south, there is this cross-border operation through Amman, Nasib border. Now the Nasib border has been open for the last couple of months, and in fact, recently our colleagues from Amman drove to Damascus. Our country director actually went from Damascus to Amman. This is a progress. A lot of business which Syria used to happen before, it is starting to take place. But what happened when this cross-border operation was stopped? How we reached the people from inside? We had pre-positioned ourselves together with other partners, and particularly SARC. And then as soon as the cross-border stopped, we tried to reach them from that end. But did we manage to reach them immediately? No. Are we still managed to reach everywhere? No. Have we made progress to reach them progressively? Yes, definitely. For example, Dara and Quneitra, those who are, you know them. We were not allowed to go there at the beginning. And you understand when some places come out of the conflict, there are many issues to be resolved before you can allow. Even our UN security will not allow us to go some places. So those are the access challenges. But now, after a few months, we have managed to go there. I myself went to Dara and Konetra border. But again, it is limited because the areas have been given progressively. But we've also made a point to the government that if we do not get access, we cannot provide the assistance. It's not WP I'm talking about. It is the UN as a whole, all the assistance I'm talking about. Because if we don't know who needs assistance, if we don't know, can't do the assessment properly, we can't. So we do go initially after maybe one time, maybe second time, a blanket distribution, but after that we said, sorry, unless we are allowed to do the assessment, we won't be able to do that. We have done our food security assessment recently, but Dara and Konetra and Duma, you heard about East Ghouta, were excluded. But recently, we have been allowed especially to go there and also carry out our assessment. So these are progress, we would say. But then, as Arif was mentioning before, people, and Syrian people are resilient, yes, and the market surprisingly functions immediately when there is access issue lifted, immediately. However, when you go to the market, you may find things, because Syria produces a lot of things by themselves. When you find things in the market, but people don't have the capacity to purchase. So that capacity, that income transfer, that has to be there. And again, the salary is there, very small, and plus a slight difference between the dollar fluctuation make a big dent in people's real income. For example, for some time, dollar versus Syrian pound remained 435, 436, stable. But only last few weeks, it went from 436 to 495. And it may not be for the people who can afford, yes, but general population, it is a big dent. And we do our market survey regularly, and that showed that people are actually worse off from the last few months before, but you think that it should be better off, but it didn't. So what are we doing? Together with our partner, together with the government, lot of, as Khaled has mentioned, that started discussing with different ministries, social welfare and labor, Ministry of Education actually implement our education program, which is one of the major focus. And we are trying to move from general food assistance towards more livelihood and resilience programming. Now, only last week or week before, our country director was here, and the executive board has approved our interim country strategic plan. We have about 5 million people in that plan, about 1 million livelihood program, about 1 million school children, and about 3 million for the general food distribution. However, the program is to move from the general food distribution towards the livelihood program. And we are also talking about what would be the modality of this transfer. We talked about cash. Similar to other colleagues which said earlier, government is not allowing cash delivery because the cash can end up different places, which may not necessarily the good thing to happen. However, they have become more open towards cash-based transfer. And in fact, about 50,000 pregnant and lactating women receive cash top-up from us as a cash-based transfer program. And this is what is going to scale up, and our plan is massive scaling up. Now the question is, this 70% area is still under the government, as we say. But do we have each and every place access same way? No, but as we mentioned, progressively it is getting better. Still from Idlib, the mortar shells comes into Aleppo, still from Deir ez-Zor. And Raqqa, we have very limited area we supporting, but it is still changing hands, sometime on the other side, sometime on this side. So these are the challenges we are facing. During all this time and in the future, how we manage to do all these things? Obviously, through partners. And SARC is one of our major partners. At one point, they're the only partner when we had started. But from there, we have moved. SARC is still our partner from the 100% to 60% to 50% to 40%. They're still delivering, major partner. But during this time, we have developed or have local agreement with another 41 partners, excluding the cross-border partners who are doing from the, about another 10 of them from Gaziantep, Turkey, but 41. And out of these 41, they were all charitable organizations, charity organizations, smaller level. So we have invested a lot together to bring them to the level where they can also deliver. Has their capacity, everybody has the same capacity? No, but some of them have actually learned very well, and they are delivering. And it will be interesting to know, many of the NGOs before were working under SARC as a subcontract. And so obviously they have also learned, and we are, so this is how we are trying to deliver. And I believe a lot of things we can discuss about Syria, and many of you have passed through that country. Many of you know that what is happening. Again, there are several fronts we have to work simultaneously. And one of the major fronts to deliver and reach to the people is our partnership. Thank you.
So thank you. Khaled, I'm still so impressed with your knowledge of 9,762 volunteers. It's great when we can rely on data, but also the 5 million, I think you said, yeah, that you're reaching. And then if we go back to the scale up that we heard from Inge earlier, from I think it was 7 or 8 million to 12 million, and then we have 1 million that we were looking at the houses in Bangladesh. All of those people. So we now have the chance for this group to engage with all the issues that we've heard. I think probably if you've heard one word repeatedly, access has been one of them, yeah? So I imagine there may be some comments on that. We've also heard about the complexity of the context in which we're working and the need to understand and be able to navigate effectively in those different contexts. And we've heard about how they change, either rapidly in the case of Bangladesh when the influx of refugees came in, or sporadically in the terms of conflicts where front lines change and where different actors change. So we've heard some fascinating context. What I want to do, I hope it's okay that this wasn't my instructions, but I'm seeing 3 empty seats here and 4 panelists down there. I'm wondering if 3 of you would like to come and join us up, because whichever one's, Mark is shaking his head, but I don't know if the other, at least if we can have someone from the Yemen panel and someone from the Bangladesh panel up here, would be great, because now it's time to get questions, to get comments for all of your experience. What are we learning working in these complex, challenging, changing environments where access, where security, where supply chain, where modality choice, where negotiation and diplomacy is needed? What are we learning? What are we learning from these places? Thank you, Janerose. That's brilliant. There's one more, and then thank you, Jim Kelly. That's fantastic. We can't exclude someone. So let's turn it over. I think we have 40 minutes or so to engage. So we've been very patient. We have time now. I'm going to maybe take a bunch of questions. We have fantastic with the mic. Someone has gone first. I see a second one here. So I'll keep my eye open. There's someone at the back. So go ahead. Questions, comments, whatever.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Régis Nakfer. I'm working for the Jesuit Refugee Service. As Louis said, to work in Bangladesh, we had to rely on our network, and the good thing is that the Jesuits were there for many years, so we could enter the country and start operating. And what we do is we try to create schools in the camp, believing, and it's a link with the topic of this morning, that creating schools is the best way to protect children. And I had a question for you, Mark. What's your view on the mid-long term for those refugees in Bangladesh? What do you think is going to happen? Because obviously the way they're settled right now is very, cannot last forever. So what's your view on the next steps?
Right. We'll take 2 more questions, and then we'll come to Mark and others. At the front here, a colleague from WFP.
I hope you will hear me. My name is Wagdi Othman. I'm based in Dakar with the regional bureau. And I've been working for WFP more than 22 years. And one of the things that, in fact, is fascinating me is Yemen and the way we are operating there. And Julien and Inge, I think this question is directed to you. It's very already complicated to be inside the country dealing with beneficiaries or dealing with authorities from both sides in a very complicated country. As people that are there, managers, you have to deal with a lot of politics. And we heard that our main donors are also, I think you used the word perpetrators in that place, and we hear also our ED very, very vocal. I've never heard an ED take such a strong political position in our organization. And for Yemen, I understand that it's required. How can you, deal with this? Do you have, problems, issues in getting to do your work there? I'm talking about almost a moral attitude of, are you having problem with your conscience?
Are you having a problem with the conscience? What a fantastic question. A gentleman at the back there. Can we get a mic? Sorry. And then we'll go to questions of conscience and other things.
Thank you. I'm Mr. Elijah Manyok. I work for SADO from South Sudan. Really, I was a little bit frustrated when I look at the agenda and there was no space for localization, and I'm a little bit happy with the last 2 panelists who have actually bring to the spotlight the element of localization. I'm very impressed with WP because they have been doing actually localization by passion. But I would like to see from how did the colleague from Bangladesh and Syria bring UN agencies and international NGOs to such a systemic approach in terms of localizing or taking the, giving local actors the front seat in terms of delivering humanitarian aid. The second thing that I would like also to learn from my colleague is a learning, because coming also from the country that is conflict affected with different kind of political dynamics, is to understand how they navigate between instrumentalization by different actors, as well as trying as much to maintain the humanitarian principles in terms of delivering with impartiality and neutrality. Thank you.
Fantastic. Welcome, South Sudan. It's great to have another context brought into the room. So, Mark, do you want to go first? The question on long-term, medium-term, long-term.
Yeah, well, okay, thank you. So I think that's a very good question. And maybe first to start by saying that actually for the last year, we couldn't use the word education, nor schools, nor books, or anything like that. We couldn't have teachers because, again, access, government didn't allow education in the camps. Finally, that is now opening up due to the advocacy of the international community, both the UNs and the civil society. So I think we have more space to actually call it what it is. So that's one issue. So, some people are reflecting on the fact that I was, with Justin, we were in Cambodia at the same time when the 370,000 Cambodian refugees came across. And the one thing that made a difference for them was education. That was really made a huge difference. And so if there's one thing that the Rohingya children and the 450 to 500,000 children are there, that we can really leave them with is some education and some skills, so wherever they go, they have the ability to kind of lead productive lives. So I think this is important, and particularly adolescents right now, because you have, while 40% of the primary schools aged students are in some type of learning center, 40%. Among adolescents, 110,000, only 2 to 3% are getting any type of education. They're just doing nothing. And so that's a real risk in terms of radicalization. It's a real risk in terms of the drug problem, because Cox's Bazar is a drug smuggling and people smuggling area. And so it's a huge risk to not do something for these adolescents. Number two, this is not sustainable to start with a $1 billion ticket, assistance per year for the Rohingya crisis. It's not sustainable. So the only way to kind of bring the cost down, there's a variety of things, but allow livelihoods. Allow people to go out and make a bit of an earning. Allow some cash into the economy. And so that's number two, is allow people, actually also give them dignity that they're able to go out and earn for themselves. And then the last thing is for us to not forget that this is a protection crisis, that the Rohingya have rights. They have refugee rights. Unfortunately, the government of Bangladesh doesn't recognize them. They recognize them as forcibly displaced Myanmar nationals, whatever that is. But they're refugees. And so refugee rights is really important for us to continue to advocate for that. And two, within the protection framework, I would say, let's not forget keeping women and children and men and boys safe. Because the level of violence in the camps is huge. At 5 o'clock, everybody leaves the camp, including the police. And so it's just a free-for-all. And so people are at huge risk. Now the police are finally, I think, staying in the camps, a few of them, at night. But mega camp has 600,000 to 700,000 people, and you may have a few dozen police. And so it is a free-for-all. It's a Wild West town at night. And so we have to do much more to keep women and children, men and boys, safe in this response.
Oh, thank you. Fabulous answer. So there was two questions that were about, well, conscience, but also instrumentalization of the humanitarian principles. I know the first question was addressed at Yemen, but I'm sure that it also applies in Syria as well. I'm sure, Khaled, you'll have some comments on that. So I wonder if we could take comments on that question in a political environment. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think it's a question of you keeping your focus really on your humanitarian mandate and trying not to get distracted by the politics around it. Of course, there are politics. You can't avoid it. It's a political crisis with many actors, right? With many interests, right? But you have to try to focus that your aim is to assist the severely food insecure population so that they don't get into a famine state. That's your task. And that's what you're focusing on. And you use the resources that you receive for that purpose, and it doesn't matter to you whether that severely food insecure person lives in a northern area, in a southern area, whether any area has just switched sites. You still aim to go there. Doesn't matter who has the control of that area, right? Because there's a lot of fluctuation going on. So, and for that to happen, you need a lot of negotiation at all levels, because particularly as we have seen in 2018, when there started to be again a lot of dynamic in the conflict. In 2017, it was kind of very static. The front lines were set. And you knew in that area you're dealing with them, and in the other areas you're dealing with those, right? But then all of a sudden it changed. And you know, but you still have your obligation to assist the severely food insecure people in that village. It doesn't matter who's controlling that village. Yeah, so I think we've been managing quite well in doing so, but there have been areas, unfortunately, because of very active front lines, where we haven't had access in a sense that we haven't been able to send supplies in. It was not a question of not having partners on the ground. Somebody was mentioning that. We had partners, we had the local staff of our cooperating partners on the ground, but the problem was we just couldn't get the supplies in there. Yeah, I mean, fortunately, those are only very, very few areas, but there are some areas, and we're very concerned about those areas, some areas in the Hodeida governorate, but as I said, there is a lot of negotiation, not just at WFP level, but it's important there also at the humanitarian coordinator level, that they come in, that the NGO partners come in and advocate on their side, right? So that it's not just seen as a WFP issue. No, it's a humanitarian issue that's taken on board by everybody. And then, mind you, as we're getting contribution from many, many donors, right? There has been also a lot of advocacy for those, as I mentioned before, not to come with strings attached. And in fact, some of the donations that we have received were not channeled directly to WFP. They were channeled through OCHA. So in a sense, we were a little bit, if I can say, protected. Yeah, so it was an advocacy that was shared between OCHA, WFP, and all the other agencies who receive that assistance. And I think that has helped for us to stay clear out of the many politics that are happening. Thank you.
Khaled, I wonder if you want to comment. Also, you can have my one if you want, but you know, the question of being instrumentalized, I'm sure you have been asked, I know you have been asked it before, let's ask it again. You know, I was really struck by your example of do not move a muscle in 2011, I think you said it was. Yeah, a little bit more elaboration on how do you continue to navigate that?
Well, I have to tell you that humanitarian diplomacy looks very different when you are in the field, really in the field. Well, when diplomacy has to face the point of the gun to get access. I mean, SARC lost 65 volunteers and staff in this crisis. Only just 2 weeks ago, one of the volunteers got injured because of a sharpener, because he refused to handle one food parcel to an armed guy in Daraa. And because of that, he shot on the ground, and the sharpener injured the volunteer. And it's not about one food parcel. It's about the principle, that when you break the principle, then you are compromised. A lot of times, there was sometimes discussions, or sometimes, well, from the party's point of view, it's not a discussion, it's an instruction that this convoy cannot reach that village because we want you to distribute in this village first, and you cannot pass this village. And the argument is, well, this village is not in need. Well, it's us who determine where you go or you don't go. And our response was always that if we are not allowed to reach where we want to reach, then we will turn and go back. And we will negotiate again that we can reach where we want to reach. The diplomacy issue is very critical, as I said, when you are in the field. For instance, about access to healthcare and to ambulances. In the crisis, we were faced with this issue. I mean, sending one ambulance to access Barze, for instance, in 2012, we were denied that. And I was in the operation room back then, and they told me, well, we don't have access. I told them, dispatch the next one. And the guys were looking like, well, we were denied access. I said, listen and dispatch the next one. And the next one reached a checkpoint and said, well, we are also denied access. I dispatched the third one, and the fourth one, and the fifth, and I went in the sixth ambulance, telling the checkpoint, well, now you have 6 ambulances with all the lights at night. I mean, you want that on Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya and all the news agencies, or let's take 2 ambulances inside and send the 4 back. And they agreed. A lot of the partnership that we have with UN agencies, ICRC and Federation is about protecting us. We cannot sometimes, as a local player, we have the strength and the power to work on the ground, but we don't have the media coverage and sometimes the diplomacy, international diplomacy. You have. So we work together, and a lot of times we play together this game. We tell the authorities, if you don't give us access, that guy, this agency, will issue something that will say something, will badmouth you in the, so you better give us access, you better give them access, we better, so this is the kind of diplomacy that we need to reach sometime, to reach the people in need.
Khaled, thank you. Fantastic answer on that. Now let's shift to the second question from a colleague from South Sudan, was about localization. And how does that become more systematically worked into responses? And I think you're addressing it, especially at the UN colleagues from the World Food Programme. So on the Janerose and Ahmed, if you would comment on that from both of you would be great.
Yeah, yes, if I noted down the question well, that how we put the 4 partners forefront. Well, I think this APC, or annual consultation, is also one of the very good attempt WFP and together us making to know if we have not put the partners in the forefront, how we can put you in the more forefront. And in fact, WFP's main principle of delivering resources, delivering services are through partners. Very rare occasions we do direct service delivery. So that is where we have more partners. We try to invest in partners in terms of capacity. Apart from that, service delivery, there are a lot of working groups or coordination mechanism, and particularly looking at Syrian operations. You have heard possibly Syria +5. There are 5 different countries, including Syria, who has either hosting or supporting through the different ways. And there are coordination mechanisms there, sometimes complex, but they are there. And there are a lot of voices given to all the partners. Similarly, inside the country, also we have various sector coordination mechanisms, including food security, whether refugee or returns, etc. And that is where we meet together and try to sort it out how best to deliver the services to the most needy people in Syria.
I can just comment that from the Bangladeshi context, there's a lot of task force meetings that includes that is organized by the food security cluster, and also thematic trainings that are done together in order to maintain and to up the capacity of the partners. And that is giving them the voice to be able to see what is there that we can do together to actually, support the humanitarian intervention that is taking place within the camps, because they have the ear to the ground. They're the ones who know what's going on, what is that is needed. And that we bring into the partnership through the thematic trainings that we do, and also the coordination through the task force meetings. So that captures and gives the voice to the local partners.
Thank you, Janerose. So, some more questions, back to the floor. Some more comments, some more questions. I'll take this 2 at the front here, and 1 just behind. Fantastic.
I go first? Okay, thanks. I'm Marit Glad, and I work for the Norwegian Refugee Council. We have as an ambition, as an organization, to become much better at working in hard-to-reach areas in general. And I think that in some countries we're good at it, we're doing well, and in others not so well. But one of the things that we've been talking about is like, we have talked a lot today about getting in and being able to operate. But we have looked at it more broadly in terms of also the quality of our interventions and also the ability to withstand an audit 3 years later when the conflict has settled and we get the audit team and not necessarily the technical people from the donor visiting. And I think there is an issue here, both in, I would like to hear maybe from the panel, both on the program quality aspects, but also then on the engagement in terms of risk sharing with donors when it comes to issues like assets being taken or offices being taken, aid diversion, and so on.
Thank you. I'm Francisco Yermo. I work in ActionAid in the humanitarian team. So it's a question of follow-up in the three different scenarios, but maybe especially in Yemen, as you're speaking about advocacy. So it's the link about what we have seen in terms of delivery, service delivery, assistance, protection from local organizations, national organizations. If you have seen, particularly because Yemen was talking about the role of national organizations, local organizations. We're interested in ActionAid, in particular women's rights organizations, in the advocacy, both at national level, international level, and maybe also in the other context. I was reading an interesting piece in Iran about the Rohingya themselves doing advocacy in terms of the, so on that. Thank you.
Sorry, I needed to turn it on. Anne Omani from Concern. Just a couple of comments on the Rohingya crisis. It has been an intense year and a half. I suppose one of the things that we have to acknowledge is the fact that the Bangladeshi government, I think, really has been very welcoming in allowing this number of people across its border into its country, creating space for it. You know, the army were in there very active in building roads, helping access, helping get the camp laid out at the very early stages. And I don't think there are many countries, certainly in Europe, that would be willing to take in, you know, over 500,000 refugees in a month at a time. So, you know, and they were under tremendous pressure from within their own populations as well to look at how they were going to manage this huge influx from a neighbouring country. They were dealing with floods in another part of the country at the same time. So there was a lot going on, and I do think we have to acknowledge that. I think there were a lot of difficulties within the UN family at the early stages. And I don't think they have gone away, actually. But I think the fact that UNHCR is not the lead agency in there has affected, to a large extent, I think, the recognition of the population themselves as refugees, in not just in the international context, but in the local context as well. And you know, UNHCR's primary responsibility is around protection and not being the lead agency for refugees in this big refugee crisis. I think is a huge issue that I do think that the UN does need to address internally to work out who leadership should go to there. And I know this was in discussion and consultation with the Bangladeshi government, but I do think the UN has a role to step up and look at where it's going. And finally, just a comment. I liked the footage on the video, but this is a partner consultation. And I didn't see one brand from any of the partners apart from WFP. So semantics, I think, is important in this situation as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Accountability in action. Fantastic. Let's start with the fantastic question from NRC. Access is a challenge. Yes, we've been talking about it. But when you get beyond having access, what about quality? And what about risk management? And with the increasing compliance agenda that, you know, the risk that we've heard about and the compliance agenda we heard from donors, how do we go beyond just access? So, yeah, whoever wants to take that one, anyone?
Well, I have a small comment about this issue because, I mean, now, for instance, in Syria, with more access, there is more challenges. In fact, the needs are more, not less. I mean, for a change, now we have the ability to do more detailed assessment. And with more detailed assessment, now, against the wishes, we have to listen. Usually, we have the standards, we have everything set from far, far away land. You should do that, and you should receive that box, and that box should be enough for 1 month for 5 people. It doesn't matter what they eat or how they eat it. I mean, I remember from the beginning of the crisis, we fought, how do you call it, hell, until we convinced WFP to include tea in the food parcel. Because for the Syria contest, they don't eat food without tea. And for WFP, well, they don't have tea. It's a small issue, but affects 450,000 food parcels a month. Now, for instance, when we enter, it was acceptable before that you enter an area, you see, you look, there is this number of people, so that means this number of families, so that number of boxes, you drop the boxes and you escape. But with access, you stay, because you are able to stay. So now you have to ask more detailed questions about, well, how do you live? What do you eat? How do you get heat in the winter? Where your kids go to school? Do they have clothes to go to school? How do they walk? Do they have shoes? Do they have books? Do they have bags? Waste management, where do you put your waste? Livelihood issues. Imagine that for livelihood, for instance, it's not about, for instance, you give people seeds. You must give people seeds in the correct time so they could use them. And you must give them tools so you can put them in the ground. And with tools, they need water. And if you give livestock, then the livestock or the sheep need to eat. So there is complex questions that need answers. Now the assessment is that thick, and with that, it needs this much answers, and it needs a complex response from us. And that is something we are not used to. We are not used to because there is no glamour in that. It wastes a lot of time and a lot of money, and there is no shine about it. The shine sometimes comes from, yeah, I got access to that area. I dropped some new boxes. Fine. But now, Daraa, for instance, as my colleague says, the south of Syria, 51 NGOs used to cover this area from the south, cross borders. Now the only player, the only organization in that area is SARC, because all cross borders stopped, so the NGOs disappeared. The aid now is coming from this area from this side of the borders, but nobody wants to talk about it. Although that the population is the same, and the beneficiaries are the same, and the people in need are the same, they are still in those areas, they didn't leave. Only the control has changed, but with that, a lot of the scene have changed, a lot of the, what do you call it, the coverage. And with that, a lot of the support have changed. So we deal with, as a local partner, we deal with UN agencies like WFP, and we look at this as a strategic partnership. But we expect that we are talking to each other on the humanitarian standards. They talk to back donors and governments on the political side, fine, but the deal with each other should be on the, what you call humanitarian needs. And the humanitarian needs are still here.
Julien, you're going to comment on this question also, but I know the second question, which I was also going to come to you on, was the one from a colleague from ActionAid on advocacy, and especially on local voices in advocacy as well. I don't know if you could bridge to that question as well.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I just want to first talk a little bit about the issue about can you pass the audit, because we talk about access in terms of field access, but we also need to talk about access in terms of the limitations of the regulatory environment that comes from our donors. And this is getting worse and worse and worse by the day. I mean, I think it's interesting that our colleague from BRAC that was supposed to come to talk on a panel at WFP didn't get a visa. So, you know, that's just an illustration, I think, of how much the humanitarian community as a whole is under attack from regulations from traditional donor governments that historically have supported humanitarian action and humanitarian principles, and now the limitation on access also is imposed within by the donors. So I think that's an essential question, like, will we pass the audit in 3 years? And I think I'll link that also to the localization question, because there is a hypocrisy, I think, in the system. Because we are saying we need to be more local, we need to go to the frontline workers, et cetera. That's what the program and the management says. Great, we all agree on that. But then the compliance side of the house, of all our houses, the financial sides of all our houses, what do? They tighten the screw, they tighten the screw, they tighten the screw. So we are, as international NGOs, setting us up for failures in an audit in 2 or 3 years. Potentially, and definitely for our local NGOs and smaller NGOs that don't have the capacity, it's really not sustainable with all those new counterterrorism regulations, et cetera, especially in all the contexts that we're talking about here, be it Syria, be it Yemen, be it in Bangladesh. So I do think we have to be honest with this conversation and see the limitations that come, and that's also, I think, part of the common advocacy that we have to do as part of humanitarian diplomacy, and saying, okay, you countries have subscribed to these things as part of, you know, international humanitarian law, as part of good humanitarian donorship, et cetera, and in reality, what we're faced with is an environment that's almost impossible to navigate, even for very well-established systems and organizations. To your question, I mean, from an interaction perspective, the CBOs and those groups are not members. What we rely upon is on our members that do have that mandate. So, for instance, I mean, for Save the Children, we'll do consultations with different types of children or youth in different contexts and bring that up to the conversations. Other organizations will do the same with either specific vulnerable groups or specific populations of displaced people or refugees, and that's how we try to get this up. But it's difficult for us as a membership organization to do it ourselves. We encourage our members to bring that voice to the table.
Fantastic. I'm going to, if it's okay, because we're running close on time, I want to transition to that last question on Bangladesh, and particularly Janerose, perhaps, you know, the role of the Bangladeshi government, perhaps being undervalued, under-recognized, but also the contrast between that and maybe European governments. You've worked in both, I was interested in that. And then the final question was the UN family. We all have families, and sometimes they have, relationship challenges. The way the UN family is working together in Bangladesh. Any comments on that, Janerose?
Yeah, the government, as our colleagues on the floor say, the government of Bangladesh has been very welcoming to the refugee population. They might not call them refugees, they might not give them that term, they might call them, you know, forcibly displaced Myanmar nationals, but the bottom line is that they are very welcoming. They have money to give, you know, they've given land to this population to be able to settle them. They've opened up access to NGOs to be able to work in this context. And at the same time, they made a conducive environment for many of, for example, WFP to be able to support the refugee crisis. An example whereby, you know, to be able to, WFP at in the initial stage of the crisis did not have enough food to be able to, to feed the population. We had an agreement with them in the beginning to have 20,000 metric tons. We could draw from the national reserves. And that we managed to rewrite that agreement to 50,000 metric tons just before the influx. And because we have been able to draw on their national, food reserves of rice. We have been able to feed the population, and they are even importing more rice to be able to support WFP in case it's needed. And that, I think, that is quite, it shows the level of commitment that they have towards, the population. And at the same time, they are when it comes to advocacy and also, inclusiveness in finding solutions and the dialogue on this community, they have a national task force, and in that national task force, they have invited both the UN, family, and also NGOs in the country to have a discussion about, the future of this group and what will happen, and I think that is a forum whereby it's easy to be able to discuss, together with the government. They might bring in, policy issues and all of that, but at the same time, they're giving access to the humanitarian community. And also, the government of Bangladesh, they might not always be, they're maybe going all full out to allow us maybe to give cash and all that, but they are meeting us halfway by saying, okay, we might not give you access to, giving out cash, but you can do cash-based transfers through, e-vouchers and, other modalities. And I think that is some of the things that we see. They are actually proactive in supporting this crisis. Okay, some of the challenges that we face, all of us, and as you heard before, was that they may not allow us to be able to, especially because they are also having an election soon at the end of this year. That is a constraint to all the humanitarian community, because they are clamping down maybe on visas, on arrival, and maybe it's protection issues. It's all of that dynamic makes it maybe a little bit more difficult for us. But at the same time, under the radar, they allow us to do a lot of positive programming that is supporting this big group. I just want to mention that the footage we saw earlier. The camp has been built by partners. The access that we have been able to open up has been built by partners. Without the partners that we've had, and the government being able to build the roads, as you mentioned before, it wouldn't have been able to, maybe WFP and its partners, to distribute food, but because they have put in the resources, monetary, protection, all of that, they have been able, it has made it possible for all of us to be able to support this massive population.
Janerose, thank you so much. I wish we had time for more questions. We actually are coming towards what some of us might find one of the more valuable bits of the day, networking, but also cocktails, the combination of which is a nice prospect at the end of a very long day. We're going to have a time to be able to thank the panelists, and I'll reflect a little bit, but we also have, as was mentioned earlier this morning, throughout the 2 days, a gender lens on the discussions we're having. And as was mentioned this morning, we're going to have a gender discussant on the end of each of the sessions. So we have one, it's actually my colleague Rachel, I believe, is going to give any reflections from a gender perspective as we come towards the end of the session.
Thanks, Justin, and thank you to everyone on the panel. It was nice to hear some key gender points mentioned throughout the discussion. I was reflecting that many of the issues raised were quite high level, 30,000-foot level issues. The political environment, the high level advocacy that needs to happen. But I really loved what Arif said, that in those types of discussions, it can be so powerful to bring the stories of children to powerful people. And I think as we take a look through the gender lens, stories of girls, stories of adolescent girls, stories of mothers who are struggling each day to survive with their children can also be powerful. I really liked, Janerose, what you brought out, that example of how WFP focused on giving women a voice and ensuring food reaches the most vulnerable women and is verified that it actually reached them. You know, I think we need those types of innovations, context-specific solutions to make sure that the vulnerable among the vulnerable receive those solutions at the very last mile. And Mark, thanks for your comment on you know, female-headed households in the Rohingya response specifically. And I was also thinking all the contexts that we've just discussed, you know, have significant cultural issues around gender in the local context. So how do we not only reach these populations, female-headed households, for example, you know, those women cannot always participate in distributions in the Rohingya refugee context. But beyond that, how do we give voice to women and girls and other vulnerable populations? And I think, you know, Julien, you hit the nail on the head, the consultations, taking the time to really have the voices come forth and take those to the highest levels, as well as the grassroots advocacy. We talked about localization. I think I really loved, Khaled, your story of persistence in humanitarian diplomacy on the ground. I think it's that kind of persistence, that kind of creative solution that we also need to bring to the gender perspective. We have to think outside of the box. And so localization, once again, we could leverage our efforts around this to empower women in civil society as well. Let's take every opportunity to bring up the gender issues, to highlight them, to give women and girls, boys and men, that specific voice on how they are experiencing the response, how they are experiencing our aid, partnering with us, and then bring those back up to the highest level issues and forums where we are giving them a voice.
Thank you very much. Fantastic reflection of what we've heard from a gender perspective. As just a few words to wrap up, and just to say thank you, all of you, individually, and Arif is not, I don't know if he's rejoined us, I know he was meeting with the ED on Yemen earlier, but the richness that you've given us, the richness of the insights, of the experiences in the three contexts we're looking at, what stays with me personally is a mixture of that challenge and of the opportunities that we have. A number of words. So this morning we spoke a lot about putting people at the center, affected populations, people, beneficiaries, those people that we serve at the center. I think we've heard many different ways through all of us in our different places in the ecosystem of trying to do that. What we've heard is there's many different ways to do that in different, you know, with the different challenges. But one thing that I think I'd like to add to the putting people at the center that we're serving is that's come across clearly to me is our own people. That to do that well, we have to be super smart, super flexible, super adaptive, super agile, super persistent, to use that word, as humanitarians in all of these contexts. You know, our own people, whether it's the volunteers, Khaled, that you mentioned, whether it's at the level of, you know, humanitarian diplomacy at the national level or in DC or, you know, at whatever level we're negotiating, you know, all of us have to be able to be those humanitarian diplomats, whether it's at the point of a gun or at the point of Congress or at the point of peace talks. And so how do we equip ourselves to be able to do that, to have those negotiation skills, those diplomatic skills that we need to negotiate whatever our place in the ecosystem is? We also heard clearly about the need to be context-specific, context-relevant, context-aware, context-understanding. The amazing market analysis, economic analysis that Arif brought on Yemen, for example, to understand that at the same time as understanding the cross-line, cross-border, and even the perspective that came from on access was, it looks very different from where you are. Is it access to us, or is it access of things, by us, or of things? So I think that the understanding of context as well, if we are to put people at the center, our people, wherever we are in that ecosystem, need to be very good at reading context and responding to context in a way that is like a finely tuned skill, and that's one of those competencies I think that we need as humanitarians in the sector. I guess I was picking up some of the words that came out. We talked about pragmatism. I think many of us in this area, we have learned to be pragmatic from experience, yeah. But we also talked a lot about principles and the importance of keeping them clean. And the importance of holding on to them and bringing them to life. Even, again, Arif's example from a faith-based perspective of bringing that to life in a way that changed people's thinking. And then you picked up the persistence, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth. So to me, I'm taking away that, shall we go out of here as persistent, pragmatic, principled humanitarian, or persistent, principled pragmatists? That's the kind of capabilities that we need to be effective in these contexts, to be persistent. We've seen examples, whether it's the port of Hodeidah and the ability to see that advocacy actually could free something up that made a massive difference, or whether it's negotiating something cross-line or working with a new partner in Syria, as we heard from several of us here. We know that at the micro level, at the grassroots level, or at the global level, that persistence, that pragmatism, and the reliance on not compromising on our principles can bring those changes. We also heard, though, about the ecosystem that we're in. And I use that word rather than, sometimes we might talk about the chain, and we see it as the chain of, the beneficiary or the people, affected populations at one end and the donors at the other. But it's much more an ecosystem in I was an ecologist many years ago, so maybe I think that way. But it's an ecosystem, and we heard strongly of the importance of the local. And thank you, a colleague from South Sudan, for pulling us on that question again back. And I think to be reminded of our commitments in the grand bargain, and to be given examples of where we can expand our partnerships, and to find ways to do that. There's no, we may have percentages, we may have targets, we may, but I think it's the ethos of that. It's the ethos of that's shifting in us. But I wouldn't want to be, while I think there is real hope there, the point that our colleague from NRC made, and then was picked up very well, I think, Julien, by yourself, the reality of that is coming up against the pressures around risks, the pressures around accountability, around compliance. These two things, we have the front line of access and negotiating humanitarian access, often with armed different groups, different parties to conflict. But the other front line that we've been talking about here is the front line between the different demands, upon us, which are not wrong. They're not wrong. None of us, in the ecosystem would say it's wrong to be accountable, would say it's wrong to be managing risk well, would say it's wrong to be able to audit or to be able to look at standards. But at the same time, there are pressures in the ecosystem which are pulling in different directions. And I think that's an important takeaway. And then finally, the last point, I also heard, I come at this as a humanitarian, that's my day job, but I heard a lot about longer term perspectives. I heard a lot about livelihoods, about resilience, about preparedness, and about education as an example, but thinking of interventions, thinking of responses in the whole cycle of that, from preparedness through to recovery, through to longer term. I'm going to use a bit of jargon that we haven't heard today, the nexus, what we used to call the relief development continuum, what we might call now the humanitarian development nexus, but thinking longer term, because the people that we serve, the people at the center, they are not just there for the initial response of a refugee population or even a protracted crisis. They are looking at their longer term needs. So my encouragement to you would be persistent, principled pragmatists out of here. Keep that hope that being those things can make a difference. We've heard that at many different places, wherever you are in the ecosystem. If you hold on to those things, we might do some good in the world, and we might do it in partnership with WFP as well as other parts of the wonderful UN family. And I would encourage you to take that into your networking, the cocktails, and whatever conversations of influence you have lined up. If you're like me, you might have a list of people that you want to see, and you have some conversations that you're on your hit list. You've not been able to do that while you've been sitting down, so enjoy doing that this evening. Bettina, thank you for hosting us today, and over to you to close the day.
This was an amazing discussion. And I think as somebody whose job it is to tell the stories of all of your amazing work to the outside world, my hats are off to you. To our friends from Syria, we mourn with you the volunteers that you lost. I can't say it often enough. We are deeply grateful for what you have sacrificed. And it starts, I mean, risking lives, you know, everyone here is smart enough to get a cushy job somewhere else. And instead, all of you go to the hardest places on this planet and do amazing work. And I just want to thank you for that, as somebody, you know, who tries to line up the newspaper people and the media people and the TV people and try to tell stories and avoid acronyms and avoid metric tons. My hat's off to all of you for the work you do, the risks you take, the families you leave behind. It starts from tea, that is so important for people. I just saw that when I was in a refugee camp in Jordan. The tea was so important, that there was the right kind of tea, and God knows how we're going to get the tea into the warehouses too. On the other hand, here, I was so touched when you talked about at 5 o'clock the people go in Cox's Bazar, and then it's the Wild West. That's touching. So let's all do a big group hug, a virtual one, and enjoy a little bit that we have this camaraderie of people who try to make the world a better place. And I just want to thank you for that. And now go off into the Red Cafe and have a little drink and, you know, chat and get something, hang out with each other. Tomorrow, 8 o'clock, coffee is there. At 9 o'clock, we start here. I'm going to whip you into shape, people. Okay, thank you.